How we know it's official.
Official. Well, welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Geographical Society. My name is Dr. Rhea Preciado. I'm a geography professor here at PCC. Super excited to have you. This is our first Friday lecture of the season. We will be having 4 of those. We're going to have this tonight. We have another one on November 7th. The first Friday of November, we have one, then we have the break. Then we're gonna do the first Friday in March, that's March 6th, and then the first Friday in April, okay? Our next talk, if you're interested, is from a little bit of a geology angle. Rob West is a professor emeritus out at ELAC, yes. And he's gonna be talking about coastal controversies, the role of scientific integrity in the study of sea cliff erosion. So a little ocean stuff, okay? Super excited that you're here. I am recording this, and so if you have friends or colleagues who weren't able to be here tonight, I will be posting a caption video link to the LAGS website. Sites.google.com/view LA Geographic, okay? This is a great place to go also if you want to help support the mission of the LA Geographical Society. We have awesome t-shirts and stickers available for purchase. Okay, aren't they cool? There's a lot of conferences coming up in California, so you might want to rep the LA region. It's a great way for us to make some money to build up our accounts, because in the spring, we have a student research symposium, and that is where we are able to hand out awards to grad students and undergrads and community college students in the LA area to come and present their research in a really chill, laid back setting, okay? Also, if you're so moved after tonight's lecture, you might want to become a member. Don't worry, it's not going to break the bank. Okay, you might even want to just become a lifetime member. That's cool too. All of that proceeds is going directly to student scholarships for the end of the year. Okay, so we're super happy you're here. Let me introduce our presenter. I'm super excited today. We're have the luxury of having Dr. Ryan Miller here, all the way from Cal Poly. So he has a BA in economics and geography from CSU Chico, master in urban planning from the University of Washington, and a recent-ish PhD in geography from UC Davis. His teaching and research interests lie on the intersection of planning and geospatial analysis, with some focuses on housing policy reform, climate gentrification, natural hazard risk mitigation, which I think we're going to get into today perhaps, sustainable transportation, and the use of geospatial methods to understand urban change. Lots of cool stuff. We're really excited you're here. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Miller.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Rhea. Thanks for coming to this, everybody. I'm really happy to see some familiar faces in the audience. Some folks I know are from Altadena, so I really appreciate you coming to this. And it's unfortunate that my experience in Paradise continues to be so relevant, but I'm hoping that part of what I can do today is share a little bit about what happened where I'm from, because I think we're going to see some similar patterns happening in this region unfolding over the next 5 years. So most of what I want to do today is talk about what I've been learning from my hometown, Paradise, and talking about ways in which it's going to perhaps apply to Altadena. And then I'm involved in a couple of projects here locally that I want to touch on as well that are sort of still in progress. So here's what I want to do today. I want to start by actually going back to 2018, a simpler time in many ways, and go back over what happened in the fall of 2018, 7 years ago now, in my hometown of Paradise, California, and the devastating wildfire that remains, I think, the deadliest wildfire in California history that happened there in the fall of 2018. And I want to talk about some of the things that are actually very similar between what happened in Paradise and what happened in Altadena this January. And also some ways that I think Altadena is a unique case. And so everything I share today, I want to be careful. There are a lot of differences between these two communities. I do think a lot of things are going to be helpful for thinking about what happens in Altadena, but I know these are two very different communities, and I'm looking forward also to learning from you guys, knowing that I have some Altadena folks in the audience today. So I really appreciate you coming here. I mostly want to share the work that I just recently completed, like Rhea mentioned, as part of my dissertation at UC Davis. It really tried to look 5 years out after the fire at where displaced residents were. And then surveying those residents to understand how many people are trying to work toward moving back versus how many people are actually not trying to move back, so that we can understand kind of the long-term redevelopment and population change that we might expect to see in Paradise. And of course, Altadena is maybe about to enter a very similar lengthy sort of recovery cycle. So I want to give you, in some cases, some sobering information about what that's been looking like in Paradise. And then, like I said, I'm involved in a couple of projects that are actually working with folks here that I'm really excited about. I've been working with the team from UCLA to talk to people about their evacuation experience, particularly people that didn't have cars, which just adds a whole other dimension of difficulty when you have a no notice evacuation from a wildfire that's coming through in the middle of the night. And then also some work I've been able to be a part of since I have been at Cal Poly. I just finished my first year there in their city and regional planning department. And one of the things we did this spring was we had a student group come down and work with some folks in Altadena to think about the commercial corridors in Altadena, and see if there's an opportunity to bring some affordable housing into commercial corridors in the redevelopment process. And then I'm also hoping in the future to do something similar to understand where people are displaced to from Altadena as what I'm going to present today from Paradise. So that's something I'm kind of hoping I get to work on over the next year. So I want to start by talking a little bit about where I'm from and this case of the campfire in Paradise, California. This is a map of the fire perimeter of this fire that happened. This was November 8th, 2018. This was the exact same day as the Woolsey fire that happened in Malibu in Ventura County. Some of you might remember that one. And this is one of those similarities between the two. This was one of those Diablo wind days kind of across the state where we had multiple firestorms in different regions, kind of like what happened in January. So these two happened at exactly the same time, really on the same days. And just a really brief kind of recap of what happened here, about 80% of the homes in the town of Paradise were destroyed. This area that's sort of in this gray hatching here is kind of known collectively as the Ridge. This is Paradise, and then there's a few smaller unincorporated communities. And there were about 40,000 people on this ridge. 80% of them lost their homes in this fire, basically all in one morning. So some very similar characteristics as to what happened in Altadena. Like I mentioned, this was an incredibly deadly event. 85 people died. I know this is hard to talk about, but many of those people died in their cars as part of the evacuation process. Again, I know there was some similar, just really intense evacuation experiences that happened to folks here and in Palisades as well. But Paradise was no exception. And in terms of what happened to the population of this town, most of my childhood in Paradise, the population was about 26,000 people. It kind of had a stable population, a lot of elderly folks, and then some newer folks kind of moving in, and it was about the same size most of my lifetime, about 26,000 people. That's what the 2010 census showed. But during the 2020 census, less than 5,000 people were in Paradise. And that number has recovered somewhat since 2020, but not as much as you might think. So I want to kind of, again, give that sobering context as to what the redevelopment and recovery is looking like. If you've seen the images or if you're from Altadena, this is not going to be a surprising aerial image for people to look at, but this is just a before and after of aerial imagery just from Google Maps about what Paradise looked like prior to the fire and then what it looked like a couple of months afterward once FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers was coming in, scraping properties and removing toxic substances from soils. Very similar process, just wrapped up here, although the one here was very expedited controversially. And as you can see, most of the residential areas, which are kind of the more forested areas in the pre-fire time period, have been completely destroyed. There are some places that survived the fire. Most of those were along our commercial strips, and as much as it's sort of difficult for me to acknowledge this as an urban planner who loves walkability, many of the commercial strip areas with huge parking lots around them actually did fairly well in the fire because that served as defensible space. And many of those structures were also concrete and steel versus the often older, in many cases, mobile homes that were really susceptible to that fire. And we saw a similar pattern in Altadena. Like I mentioned, I'm from Paradise, so this is a very personal topic for me, obviously. I spent most of my childhood there, but I think it's worth noting this because this is another similarity with sort of the story for a lot of people in Altadena. Originally, my family is from the Sacramento Valley. I grew up mostly with my grandparents. We were a pretty low income household. And when my parents in the 90s finally decided, all right, we need to move out on our own, I was in the single digits. Where we could find an affordable place to live was Paradise. It was sort of the affordable bedroom community suburb for this area around Chico in the Sacramento Valley. So a lot of those 26,000 people were folks that were sort of, in many cases, the workforce for businesses in Chico and surrounding communities, including my family. So we weren't tied to this place before the 90s. This was a place we sort of moved to be able to have our own space and to have some privacy. This was our double wide mobile with an add-on. So I had my own room when we moved here, which I was very happy about. This is the pre-fire. And of course, my home, along with the homes of basically everybody I grew up with and went to high school with, was destroyed in this fire. This is the image that we were given by CAL FIRE. They went through, as they did in Altadena, and surveyed properties even before people were allowed back on their properties. So about a week after the fire, this is the image we got. We kind of knew, we had a feeling if any house was going to survive, it was probably not our double wide mobile from 1973 that was floated in pine needles. So we had a feeling, right? And in December of that year, they started allowing people back into their properties. So this is what we went back to. This is a picture I took with my younger sister, my brother, and my mom. All three of them lived in the house when this happened, and they had a really scary evacuation as well. My sister and my brother were actually home alone. My sister was 16, 17 at the time and was responsible for getting her and my brother to safety, packing up as many pets as we could, although we lost the cat, and was stuck for hours and hours in a really scary evacuation. But her story is not unique among people from Paradise. That's a very typical evacuation story. So obviously this is a topic that's really personal for me. And I want to give a little recap about just the recovery and the rebuilding in Paradise. So rebuilding is unfolding truly slowly, on a scale that maybe looks more like what disaster researchers are finding in like Puerto Rico or Hurricane Katrina, where we're really talking about a decades-long recovery cycle, not a years-long recovery cycle. I actually just pulled these this morning to update this with 2025 information, but these are population estimates that the California Department of Finance puts together. And just as an aside, like in general, these estimates tend to be really good in years between census years. So if you ever need to know population in an inter-census year, California Department of Finance is really good at keeping track of this. Here you can see that stable pre-fire population. The fire happened in the fall of 2018, and then a really slow recovery where that population starts to recover 2 or 3 years after the fire. But today, we're still not even up to half of the residents that were at pre-fire. So just to keep that in mind. Obviously, there was a lot of other things going on macroeconomically during this era that might be part of this story. And obviously, we're in an era now in Altadena where there's a lot of other things going on as well, beyond the recovery that might be impacting their timeline as well. There's a lot of issues in the reconstruction. I apologize, this might be a little low, this text, but one of the things that people in Paradise are facing is that so much of the pre-fire housing stock was sort of what we think of as like lowercase a affordable, right? It was sort of just affordable without government subsidy because it was a lot of old residences. It was a lot of mobile homes, like where I lived, a lot of mobile home parks. this is a place that was affordable. The median home price before the fire was under $200,000 in Paradise. So in some ways, this was like one of the last affordable refuges in California. Part of the reason it became such a popular retirement community. And just by the nature of updated building codes, which are really well intended, right? And provide a lot more fire safety than pre-2010s fire codes would have. Just to get anything built today is gonna be so much more expensive on a property by property basis as those structures pre-fire. So the things that are getting built tend to be larger houses, tend to be on some of the larger, maybe what real estate folks would think of as the more optimal lots for development. And so it's a different community than what we had before the fire. That's not unique. There's a whole literature out there about sort of like post-disaster gentrification, and we are seeing that a little bit in Paradise. That being said, it's also a lot of former residents who are moving back. It's just expensive to do that. Paradise also lost some of its amenities. There used to be a hospital up on that ridge. There used to be a lot of retail establishments. It was sort of, as much as it was a bedroom community, it was self-sufficient in some ways. And many of those things have gone away since the fire. So it's a little harder, especially for older folks, maybe to think about living up there. There's now a hospital 30 minutes away, but not one 5 minutes away in town. So that amenity loss continues to be a problem in the recovery as well. And I think it's worth thinking about, obviously our number one priority in recovery is always housing. But other things are important too, right? It would be difficult to have 26,000 people back on the ridge and not have that hospital and those grocery stores that have gone. So it's all important, not just housing. Like I showed you in that graph, the population of Paradise today is still less than half of what it was before the fire. And we're coming up on 7 years after the disaster. One bright spot that I do want to mention is that Paradise has sort of intentionally been putting a lot of effort into community events, knowing that a lot of folks are displaced, but they're displaced locally. So the ability to go back to like a community festival and go participate in those rituals that we all know from growing up there has been a really important piece of the recovery process. And I think that's an important thing to think about for Altadena as well. Having events that allow displaced people to still come and be part of the community and have those events that they remember from their time living there. Paradise has been very intentional about getting right back to those events that they used to have before the fire. There's a whole festival surrounding the gold nugget that was found there in the 1800s. It's like gold country. And as an aside, there's a really corny Huelhauser episode about it. If anybody wants to go watch that, you can Google it. I was just kind of mentioning this, but there is a lot of new housing going up in Paradise. It looks very different. There still is really a lack of the kind of dense vegetation that sort of made Paradise have its sort of private feeling that was there before the fire. There's views that when I was a kid never existed because of the amount of devastation, and I know that's very similar for folks that are in Altadena. And we're also seeing really different new housing. I'm really interested to see what we think about the designs, 10, 20 years from now, because every single new house has this like white siding and black trim and black roof. It's like the Paradise is gonna be stuck in time in 2023 forever because of this new housing, but like I said, much of that is metal siding. It's built to better codes. It is built to be more fireproof in the future, but it's also more expensive. And then another issue that I know has remained a problem for years after the fire, including today. There were still a lot of folks that owned their land and sort of have the intent to rebuild eventually, but that didn't have insurance on their home or didn't have the resources to think about rebuilding a permanent structure. So there are still to this day folks that are living in trailers or RVs or like fifth wheel campers that they have parked on their property, right? It's still their property. And so this is a really hard thing to grapple with because the town of Paradise, it's an incorporated city, but they call themselves a town to be sort of rustic, has been really struggling to kind of force people to get permits and to not allow people to live in vehicles on their own property. They continue to sort of push the deadline back for when they're gonna say you need to have a permanent structure, but this continues to be a real issue. There are still folks living on their property, but just living in vehicles, or living in RVs, even 7 years after the fire. that was kind of just the recap of what happened in Paradise, but I want to sort of more explicitly talk about some of the similarities and differences between what happened here and what happened in Paradise. So just some of the things that jumped out to me, both as a resident and through my work. The first one that really stands out to me, and this was a core like driving factor in actually getting my dissertation done, is that I felt as a Paradise resident that our fire was sort of overshadowed by a more glitzy, more maybe visible, more eyes from the media on this fire that happened in the coastal part of Southern California. So as you'll remember from January, right, that January firestorm also included the Palisades fire, which in the eyes of maybe media from out of state, or even in the eyes of disaster recovery, maybe that's what people are thinking about and focusing on. And certainly I felt when our fire happened, that the bulk of the attention was on the Woolsey fire in Malibu and the images of mansions burning and the articles about the Kardashians hiring private firefighters in Calabasas and everything like that, right? And those experiences could not be more different, even though we're in the same state. And so I know this is not an exact one-to-one comparison, but having spent some time in Altadena through various projects, I'm starting to feel like there's a similar dynamic happening here where a lot of folks in Altadena maybe feel like they didn't get that attention, that level of resources. And in very real ways, I think Altadena saw that in the initial evacuation systems and some of the problems of governance that unfolded when the fire happened. And so I think this is a real similarity. And if you'll allow me to be really corny geography professory for a second here, this split where we have maybe the really wealthy community that's impacted, and then we have the more lower income marginalized community that's impacted, has been in the geographic literature for decades and decades, specifically when we think about hazards and who's exposed to them. So I like to sort of share this as maybe a silly example, but I think there's something to glean from this. On November 8th, 2018, both of these houses were destroyed by wildfires. You guys already know this is my mom's house where I lived when I was in high school. And this mansion over here is owned by Camille Grammer. Her mansion was valued at about $6 million in Malibu. Here's my mom's house. That's my mom, my sister, our dog Max. Our little mobile with an add-on was valued at $225,000. But both these houses burned on the same day. And by the way, does anybody recognize this name? Does anybody know Camille Grammer? Yeah. Depending on your age, so if you're my age or above, you know her as Kelsey Grammer's ex-wife, right, Frasier. If you're maybe my age or below, you know her as a Real Housewife of Beverly Hills. Anybody in that camp? Seasons 1, 2, 9. Ask me how I know. If you want about her experience in the wildfire, it actually happens in season 9. And it's a focus of the season. So of course, that was part of the Woolsey fire, mostly in Malibu and parts of Ventura County, and this was the campfire in Paradise. And I don't say this to minimize the loss that Camille went through, right? And that other residents of places like Malibu went through. Losing everything is really hard, regardless of your level of wealth. However, we see that this kind of parallels what we see from the hazards geography literature. So Gilbert White and others have been writing about this for decades, that there tend to be these two groups of people that are disproportionately exposed to natural hazards. And a lot of times this is framed as kind of the developed world versus the developing world. But I think overlooked part of this is that even within very wealthy societies, we also have this inequality that kind of causes differential risks to natural hazards. So Gilbert White writes that the people who are disproportionately exposed to hazards either tend to be people who are choosing to live in those places like the wildland urban interface that's susceptible to burning in a wildstorm, who are seeking livelihood or simply the amenity and recreation value of hazard-prone lands. Or maybe it's people like Camille, I want to have my estate in Malibu so that I'm not in the city, I have my privacy. And there's more of a choice that's part of that decision, right? Versus people that are pushed into dangerous areas by virtue of poverty and land scarcity. And I don't say this to say that folks in Altadena didn't like living there, or that they weren't there by choice. And there are many folks in Paradise who sought to live in Paradise for many reasons. But I do think we have to think about the amount of people that might fall into both of these groups, in maybe a Malibu versus a Paradise or an Altadena. And I think this is worth thinking about when we think about the level of public resources that gets spent fighting fire and then in the recovery process. So I'm about to do a sin of a professor and put a really long quote up on the board. You do not have to read this whole quote, but I want to just summarize it for you. So the geography nerds in the room might recognize this name. Mike Davis, who was a local geographer here at UC Riverside for decades, and a beautiful writer about sort of the Los Angeles region and its history. And I highly recommend anything he's ever written in general. Wrote about this in the early 90s, the way that we seemingly are willing to put infinite resources toward protecting mansions in Malibu. And it's sort of framed almost as this like military battle, like we need to do everything we can to protect these mansions up on the hill that are in a place that burns every 20 years unless there's human intervention, versus all of the other ways we could protect life, protect people from hazards that we just overlook because it's not framed in that same way. Part of what Mike Davis was doing is he was comparing in the early 90s the millions and millions and millions of dollars that was spent fighting fires in Malibu to the pittance of money it would have required to do things as simple as install smoke detectors in multifamily housing near downtown Los Angeles. In the early 90s, there was a series of tenement fires in like the Westlake neighborhood near MacArthur Park, where families had died, immigrants had died in these tenement fires. And that would have been such an inexpensive fix, except, hiring adequate staff at the LA County Housing and Building Department isn't seen in that same lens as like this crisis that we need to fight for. Versus when we just have property threatened in Malibu, it becomes this huge mobilization, get the air tankers out, get everything out. And so again, I'm not saying this to say we shouldn't be fighting fires and protecting property and life, but the amount of attention we put to some areas versus others should be called into question. And that's sort of Mike Davis's point here. This is an essay, The Case for Letting Malibu Burn, that later became part of his book, Apology of Fear, which I highly recommend. I also want to talk about some other similarities. In both of these instances, these were really no notice evacuations, and there were failures of communication in both instances. So both in Paradise and Altadena, for most people, they didn't get an evacuation warning. Their warning was fire in their neighborhood, or it was a neighbor pounding on their door, right? This is really common to both. And so what that means is many people in both places fled with like little or no time to grab belongings. Like imagine the difference between having 10 minutes to gather your most important things versus having 30 seconds because your house is on fire, right? And think about just even the things you could collect in that time that you would miss if you had to leave at a moment's notice. And I want to point out, I think an evacuation like that, even if you didn't lose your home, is traumatic for everybody. It's especially traumatic for people that face obstacles in their transportation. And so I'm going to close with one of the things I'm working on now, but we've been talking with people that didn't own a car. One of the other things that's similar between Altadena and Paradise is just how deep into an urban community that fire went, affecting people that never really thought of themselves as living in that wildland urban interface. And so it reached a lot of neighborhoods where people could pretty easily live without a car until you suddenly have to leave at a moment's notice and the special problems that created for people. I also want to mention some of the things that do make Altadena fairly unique from Paradise. And so one of the things I want to acknowledge is, Paradise in many ways was a pretty homogenous, both culturally and socioeconomically community. It was an older, mostly lower middle income, vast majority white residents. And Altadena looks a little different along all of those dimensions. There's a little bit more of a diversity in socioeconomics, diversity of race. Part of that stems from Altadena's history, as I'm sure folks in this region know well, of places like Pasadena and South Pasadena being heavily redlined, having racially restricted covenants. So going back decades and decades, Altadena was a haven for families of color during that time. And so for those reasons and many others, Altadena just looks a little different. There's greater diversity of, I think, resources, of needs, and of sort of neighborhood character between different portions of Altadena than maybe the way I would characterize Paradise. And this is just a map using some census data that one of my students at Cal Poly put together. This is a little wedge of West Altadena that we focused on in a project, showing that there are multiple census block groups where the population is predominantly Black in this red census tract, or predominantly Hispanic or Latino in the blue ones. So a lot of racial diversity, a lot of diversity of many types. Another difference, and I mentioned this earlier, Altadena is just part of unincorporated Los Angeles County, right? So there really is no local governance. There is like an informal town council that gathers community input and interfaces with the county supervisor, but that's not a formal governance system the same way that Paradise has with its own taxation authority and its own ability to set policy. So that means by default, it's going to be a little harder for community members to voice what they really want to see in the recovery period, because all these decisions are getting made truly in an office building in downtown Los Angeles, right? And there is one county supervisor who's been very attentive from what I understand, but who also has many, many communities that she's responsible for beyond just Altadena. Right, so differences in governance can make a big difference. All right, here's a really corny picture of me couple years ago, a couple summers ago, when I was gathering data in Paradise. And so really the next big chunk of this talk I want to share with you guys is going back to what happened in Paradise and sharing sort of the maps of where people went, but then also some of the findings that we gathered from talking to former residents of Paradise and people who were able to stay about why they're in Paradise and why they're working toward moving back or not. So here's my colleague Mitchell Snyder, also just finished his PhD, who's a professor now up at Delta College in Stockton. We collaborated on this project together. He's also from the region. And I want to share some of the highlights from this work because I think this might be relevant in thinking about the long-term redevelopment here. So again, my motivating questions, this fire actually happened like 2 months into my PhD program. So I started at UC Davis in 2018 thinking I was going to do this totally separate project on like transit and zoning and whatever. And then suddenly my whole world turned upside down. And so I just had to ask these questions because this is what so many of my friends were facing and their families were facing. The first one was to just understand where people went. 80% of the people in that community lost their home. Where did they go? And are they working toward moving back or not? And then I started reading some of the literature from things like Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Katrina about the sort of disparate level of resources between people who were able to stay and people who were displaced. And then I became really interested, like, well, who is even able to get back to Paradise in any kind of, time frame of years instead of decades, and who's going to remain displaced? And then I was also able, through my work, to do a survey of people that had formerly lived in Paradise. And through talking to former residents, I was able to understand what are people's motivating factors about trying to move back versus not. Again, these were all things that were happening to my friends, happening to their parents, happening to a lot of the people around me. And so I wanted to try to go from just the anecdotal knowledge of my sort of immediate environment to getting a more complete picture of what this looked like for people. So I want to move kind of quickly through this part. This is like the boring math part, but the methods that I used to do this actually relied on some sort of creepy data that private businesses are continuously collecting. So probably everybody in this room has been victim of one of these companies in some way or another, but there are multiple data aggregator companies. One of them is Data Axle. This was the one that I was able to plead with for some data. Who actually maintain databases on every single household in the United States. And they track when you move to a new address, or you start forwarding mail somewhere, or you get a new credit account at a new address. And their reason for compiling all this data is so that they know exactly what kind of junk mail to send you, truly. So companies will pay them for this data. However, you can also use it for good because this is, sadly, in this country, one of the best ways to get a sort of complete snapshot of how people are moving within the United States, because you have to have access to these credit reports and things like this to really understand. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best snapshot you can get using this kind of after the fact data. So I was able to get a hold of this data where any household that was within the fire perimeter in 2018 before the fire, if that household was tracked as moving someplace else, or even if it appeared in the database at all, even in the same address, I was then able to pull the current address for that household in 2022, so 4 years after the fire, to try to map out that diaspora. And that also enabled me then to do kind of the more fun part, which was now I have addresses for thousands and thousands of people who used to live in Paradise. Now I can ask them questions and see how they're doing. So we sent a invitation out in the mail, and then I also just for any students in the room, it's always really a good idea to study the community that you're from if you get an opportunity to, because that means you can also sort of guilt all of your siblings and their friends and everybody you went to high school with for taking your survey as well. So I use those methods as well, and I gathered over 600 surveys from people that lived in Paradise before the fire. Just to give you a little picture of what this looks like, this is what this data looks like in GIS. You can tell how long ago I did this if you're a GIS person, because this is ArcMap, not ArcGIS Pro. But this is my mom's house. This is the data I got from Data Axle. And they have information about everybody they think still lives in the household. Here's the ages of everybody. So it's my mom and me and my siblings. Here's our information. They even had a guess at our credit score and the value of our home. And I had this data for every single person in my town.
Wow.
Did I snoop into my friend's database that I probably shouldn't have? Yeah, but to spot check and verify, very important. Thank you, thanks. But the cool thing that this data enabled me to do really was just to visualize this like household to household location relocation between 2018 and 2023. So in some ways, this is kind of like the most important map of that first part of the work. Is just where do people go? This isn't a perfect snapshot, so I want to be clear. The only people who end up in this database are people who formally left a trace of their relocation, right? So folks that were living off the grid, or if your partner is the one putting their name on everything, there are people that are left out in this data set. And trust me, in Paradise, this is rural Northern California, state of Jefferson, like grow weed in your backyard country, whatever. There were a lot of people off the grid who are missing from this data set. So this data set is predominantly people who are, have some credit, or they took out a new loan someplace or whatever. Nevertheless, it was still 8,000 households, and it was fairly representative of Paradise residents overall. So I want to share some kind of just summary of where people went and then jump into the survey part. Of all of these households, a huge percentage of them, a plurality of them, actually still lived within 10 miles of the fire. And I think this might be a similar pattern that we're seeing here. A lot of people lost their home, but not their job, because Paradise was such a bedroom community. So there was still something really anchoring them there in a way that is maybe different from what happened in New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, right? So a lot of people then really were doing everything they can to try to stay and rent locally or live with friends and family locally. And then we have this long tail distribution of people who moved a lot farther away. This is a little bit of an aside, but I also overlaid CAL FIRE's fire modeling onto the locations where people have sort of ended up after being displaced from Paradise. And I linked this to their estimated home value before the fire, just to kind of look into this question of climate gentrification and repeat exposure to hazards. And an interesting little piece of this is that the people that today have been displaced to other areas that have a very high fire risk were also statistically significantly likely to have come from the lowest value homes when they lived in Paradise. So there might be some effect here where those who have more choice in where to live and more money to do so are actually preferring in their relocation to go to some place with less risk, for many reasons. We'll get into that a little bit in the survey. There was also a little bit of a pattern with age. People that were sort of below 30, young people, were much more likely to have stayed closer by. A lot of older residents were the ones that were moving much farther away. In many cases, it was to move to like where their kids had moved to, just to keep that family unit together. And then this is not unique to Paradise. This comes up a lot in the housing and disaster literature. Renters are much more likely to actually be closer in than owners. And a lot of the reason for that is that they probably lacked that insurance payout, which was what buoyed a lot of people to be able to go elsewhere in the state or elsewhere in the country. These people are probably more likely also to be less economically mobile in general, right? They probably have a nearby job that they're working in Chico or Orville or Sacramento or someplace close by. And then also the length of time you were at your address in Paradise before the fire was slightly predictive of how far away you moved. So those who had been in Paradise less than 5 years were moving farther on average than the other age cohorts. or tenure cohorts, I should say. All right, but sort of the more interesting part, or additional interesting part, was the data that I got from that survey of people. Like I said, we got 630 complete surveys, which we were pretty happy with. Nobody checks their mail because of the company we bought the data from, so we were really happy to see that some people really did want to share with us about their experience. The vast majority of people that responded to our survey got that piece of mail that I sent to all 8,000 households. And then these are all the people that I guilted to do it, 47 sent to me by someone I know, that was usually me. And then I did some broadcasting on social media and other methods, and put posters up in Paradise as well. And by the way, my family's still in that region, so I was visiting that region a lot anyway. I asked people first just to get an idea of how representative this sample was, if they had lost their home, if their home was damaged, or if it was unaffected. The vast majority of people who took my survey reported that their home was completely destroyed, and this tracks with CAL FIRE's estimated destruction percentage. And this is a really interesting chart that I'm gonna sort of unpack in the next couple of slides. Of all the people that I talked to, a lot of them had moved back to Paradise already 3 or 4 years after the fact. Part of that is sampling bias because of the way that I asked that question. Part of it is that the data set I use is probably better for people who stayed versus people who moved someplace else. They were less likely to be in that initial data set. But of the people who didn't live in Paradise 4 years after the fire, when I surveyed them, I also asked them this question: would you move back to Paradise under ideal circumstances? Whatever that means to the survey respondents. And over 40% of them said no, they would not move back. And I think this is a really important piece of the recovery process. As much as there are going to be people that are really excited and motivated to move back, the recovery story for some people is starting over someplace else. And I always want to make sure we're inclusive of those people too, and they're not feeling left out of the narrative, because that's an important piece of this. And it's certainly been the case for some members of my family and friends. This is responses to that same question put on a map of where my survey respondents came from. And one of the things I want to highlight here is that, so a blue dot is somebody that says, yes, I want to move back to Paradise under ideal circumstances. There's really a cluster of blue dots right next to Paradise, mostly people that were displaced locally, like Chico, Orville, versus a much more disparate pattern as we get farther away from the North Stage. So I do wonder if we're going to see a similar pattern here. Folks that are renting in Pasadena, for example, that were able to find something locally, might be those ones that are really excited to be able to eventually rebuild and move back. But we might also have people that have already relocated much farther away and don't necessarily have plans to go back to Altadena. I'm going to move sort of quickly through this statistical part for the sake of time, because I see I only have 15 minutes left. And I want to make sure I have some time for questions, but one of the things I did here was, I also did some regression modeling on this data. As you'll learn as a student, looking at just 2 variables at a time never really tells you the full story, because there's always other things, especially in the social sciences. There's always a million different variables. We live in a messy world. But just briefly, I asked people a lot of things about themselves, like their age, their level of education that they had obtained. I also asked them a lot of opinion questions, things like living in Paradise is part of my identity on a strongly agree to disagree scale. And then I also asked things like, who do you blame for the fire? Because I was really interested in how the way people conceptualize what happened to them influences maybe their desire to return or not. This is a chart showing us responses to that question, where I asked people who or what they blamed for the fire. And actually, for all 6 of these categories, respondents were asked to rate whether or not this thing was not at all responsible, somewhat responsible, or very responsible. And by the way, here's another parallel with Altadena. Right after I did this survey, our local utility was deemed legally responsible for the fire. And you see that showing up here. The vast majority of respondents said PG&E was very responsible, right? Not a surprise. Similar here with SoCal Edison, right? But I was kind of more interested, because this one was fairly obvious, in these other things. I asked people if they thought climate change was responsible, and I had kind of an even split across these 3 categories. And then I asked people, and again, I hear both of these sides, depending on who's social media I'm looking at or who I'm talking to from back home. It's also more of a conservative community than many places in more urban parts of California. A whole lot more people blamed environmental or logging practices for the fire than blamed climate change. And I was really interested in that as a potential explanation for why some people are excited to move back and others might not be. Okay, so this is the statistical part that I'm going to kind of jump through and skip the statistics. But I basically ran one model where I just looked at, like, what are the things that predict people's likelihood to have remained in paradise versus still be displaced? The highlights from that one is people that lived in mobile homes and people that were considered rent burdened pre-fire were much more likely to still be displaced. I think that makes a lot of logical sense if we think about economic mobility, your ability to have the resources to even think about coming back and rebuilding. I also asked people about their confidence in their ability to handle wildfires, and people who said they felt strongly confident that they could handle a future wildfire were 50% more likely to be back in paradise than the group that was displaced. And then interestingly, age and race were also significant above and beyond all the other things that were in this model. And this goes counter to a lot of the other disaster literature. Actually, non-white respondents were more than twice as likely to have gone back to paradise or remained in paradise, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then age was a little bit less of a surprise. For every additional year of age of the respondent, they were 2% less likely to still be in paradise, which kind of tracks with that. Older folks were actually more likely to go someplace else. And then I did another regression where I just predicted, okay, what predicts whether or not you would at least consider moving back versus the folks that said, I don't want to go back to paradise? Because I think this is a really interesting question. And a lot of folks in paradise are curious, are we going to have 26,000 people again? Maybe not if there's a huge cohort of folks that are displaced that have no plans to return. And just very quickly, the highlights from that. People who said that they felt that the Ridge, paradise, was part of their identity were more than 3 times more likely to say they want to go back. That's kind of obvious. But in a multiple regression, you need to have this and all the other things too. So we can see how all these additional factors beyond just this identity question influence people's willingness to go back. I also asked people how safe they felt in their new neighborhoods, and people who reported a drop in safety were more than twice as likely to want to return. Again, I wonder what some of the parallels might be for folks that were displaced to different parts of the Los Angeles basin from Altadena. And then interestingly, people who blamed logging or environmental practices for the fire were almost twice as likely to say they wanted to return as well. This is a little bit of a side question for me, but I'm sort of wondering if these folks, because they're not thinking as much about climate change, for example, are a little more willing to say, I can move back and I can clear my property, or we can log the forest or rake the forest, as President Trump said back in that time, Trump 1.0. Maybe they think because they're not thinking about climate change that these other things will make them safe. And I think that's an interesting question I want to keep exploring. And then again, I'm going to move quickly through this for the sake of time. I can talk more about the survey results, but I just wanted to show those highlights. I also want to mention a couple of things I'm working on in Altadena right now. For the most part, these are things where there's a much larger group of like smarter and more connected people than me, and I'm just giving a little piece. So I want to make sure I credit my colleagues here. I'm working with the team mostly from UCLA, but also from a few schools around the country where there's experts in evacuation behavior to better understand people's evacuation, particularly people that didn't own a car. So I just want to mention this project very briefly. We actually did a survey through the transit path, if anybody uses that to get real-time transit information. And we asked people what their evacuation was like. And this covered both Altadena and Palisades and East Hollywood. There was the Sunset Fire that people evacuated from. And so we actually obtained over 1,000 responses to this survey. And then we did some additional face-to-face and online interviews with people who wanted to share more of their story, like point by point, and their decision-making process. And I just pulled a couple of quotes from that interview work. Mostly I've just been helping do the interviews. The rest of my colleagues have been doing the statistics and did the survey. We talked to, this was an elderly woman in Pasadena who was really excited to share her story. This is somebody who uses supplemental oxygen, didn't have a car, and was alone, and called 911 to try to get some help. This was right on the border of Altadena, so she didn't end up losing her home, but was stuck in that thick smoke and needed to get out. depending on what could have happened, could have lost her home, right? And this woman said eventually she gave up and just started walking down the street in heavy smoke. I didn't include this part of the quote, but she talked about how she couldn't breathe at certain points, and so she decided to sit down on the sidewalk, and this was like a woman in her eighties, and then get back up and keep walking. And eventually she ran into a police officer who took her to the Sierra Madre light rail station so she could try to get someplace else in LA. This was another person we talked to in Palisades who had been renting a room in a friend's house and didn't have a car, and his friends were gone. So he had to knock on his neighbor's door and convince his neighbors it was time to evacuate. His neighbors didn't want to. And so he described how hard that was and how he felt like a burden getting in someone else's car. So he didn't pack very much. He was like, all I wanted was just one little backpack because I didn't want to like take their trunk space, right? And so that negotiation was horrible. And then he lost everything that wasn't in that backpack. So his house burned down. This resident told us, by the way, he actually relocated to Manhattan Beach. He was able to get another rental. And the first thing he did was bought a car. Understandable from an evacuation perspective, but the urban planner in me isn't, this is not maybe the best outcome, right? But very understandable and understandable for him. Maybe it was the best outcome for him. And then the other thing I want to mention is I've been lucky enough in my role at Cal Poly to be able to help Cal Poly with some of their studio projects. So I teach for the city and regional planning program, and we really make our students do a lot of hands-on learning as part of their education. And so we were actually in Altadena back in April of this year, so pretty soon after the fire, having community events and trying to do some community-driven design. This was an event we had in the parking lot of Fair Oaks Burger on Fair Oaks and Lake. Right next to the grocery outlet, which is the last operating grocery store. At least one of the few grocery stores that did not burn in Altadena. That's another parallel because that's our only grocery store in Paradise as well. Grocery outlet. Gross out, exactly. But hey, it's great. It's a great community anchor. These are some pictures of our students just interacting with community members. We had them drawing on maps, putting up posters of like, here's what's important to preserve. Here's where a memorial should go. We were really asking people to just tell us your story about Altadena and put it on a map. And then I just want to highlight one little piece of my students' work. Again, all credit to my students. This is Emma, Carlos, and Audrey's team. We had different teams focus on different areas of Altadena. And part of what we wanted to do was to just think about the commercial areas. And we heard from many community members that they wanted to see more affordable housing. They didn't want to see Altadena get gentrified. There's a really big, you might see the signs in people's yards, Altadena is not for sale, right? So part of our thinking is maybe there's an opportunity to also build some housing as the commercial areas redevelop. We also heard from community members though that they wanted to preserve the small town character of Altadena. And we thought another way to maybe accommodate that is the places where we are going to build maybe affordable rental housing should maybe just be along those commercial corridors. So my students came up with some designs. This is the very upper part of Lake, where Lake and Altadena Drive come together. So up that way, a ways. They proposed these designs that mostly had ground floor retail, a couple stories of housing. They even proposed a new transit center at one of these intersections. And I was just really impressed with my students' work and how they took in community input in coming up with these designs. So this is just one piece of a much larger project where my students at Cal Poly, these are juniors at Cal Poly doing this work, have come up with these designs for what Altadena might look like in its recovery. They also thought about the unit mix, how many units could be affordable, how might these things get financed, and so here's a three-dimensional view of that upper Lake corridor. And by the way, this is all conforming to existing zoning. So this actually could get built with the right financing. Parts of Altadena received an upzone not very far before the fire to allow this kind of housing on top of retail. Okay. So I know I'm getting close to the end of my time here, so I want to kind of wrap this back up with just some of my thoughts about what I hope people from Altadena might be able to take from my experience. You know, I love my students' designs, but I don't want to claim that any one of my students' designs is like the best thing to do going forward. I really hope that community leaders, business leaders, policymakers focus on practical, affordable solutions that is sensitive to what that community was like before the fire. You know, there is often a sense that we need to totally redevelop and change everything. I don't think this is the right place to do that. There may be a time to do that in the future, but it's going to require more state and federal resources. And I think that should look like fire breaks around the edge of communities as opposed to radically changing the design of communities. I also, again, want to reiterate that recovery does look different for everybody. So as much as I understand and I appreciate that Altadena is not for sale signs, there may be some people for whom selling their property and starting over someplace else is their best solution. And I know that's hard, but I want to make sure those people are included in the recovery narrative. Starting over someplace else is not giving up. For some people, that's the best option. And then also, there are going to continue to be a lot of locally displaced families living in Pasadena, living in Sierra Madre, living throughout the San Gabriel Valley for years, maybe even decades, who are going to still want to go back to Altadena to participate in community events. So I think it's really important that Altadena thinks about, again, I know there's not a formal government, but community leaders thinking about how do we come up with reasons to bring people back to appreciate what was here, especially for those people that don't live here anymore, but that want to be part of that community in the rebuilding process. And I want to close on a sobering note. Like I said, I think there is a time, maybe that time is now, that we are going to have to radically start rethinking our land use and our relationship with our flammable forests that we live in. But unfortunately, our entire planning history, and this is a quote by the authors of the most commonly used intro to planning textbook in California, but I think it's prescient even today. The history of fire and the threat of future fire have not influenced California's land use planning or growth patterns in any meaningful way. I think that Altadena is a place that, with better management of public land and better management of our electrical infrastructure, can stay fairly safe. A place like Malibu, where people are defending these sort of tentacles of development out into the chaparral wilderness, might not be defensible forever. In fact, maybe it's not already. We spend too much resources on that and not enough on other things, arguably. So it's ending on kind of a sobering note, but I think this is important to think about. And then if we really want things to change, we're going to need state level and federal level resources to really rethink our relationship with living in the wild and urban interface. And that's the end of my talk. And hopefully there's still a couple of minutes for questions.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah,
That
thanks
was
to everybody.
fantastic.